So I think we are up to lecture number 111 in our lecture series of the Guide for the Perplexed. Again, page numbers referred to the Shlomo Penis edition, volume 2, this edition right here, of the Guide for the Perplexed. We are in part 3, chapter 24. And I'll just summarize the first half of the chapter, and I'm going to summarize a little bit of what I read from Kenneth Zieskin's book last time. And basically, the Rambam is discussing the issue of what does it mean when the Torah says that God tests someone out, right? That God does a nisayon. He tests someone out. In other words, he gives him a trial. And the simple reading seems to mean that God will put someone in a difficult, usually painful situation to see how he behaves, to see what he's going to do, in order that he can hopefully rise to the occasion and therefore get rewarded for his behavior. And it should be obvious to anyone who's been studying with us until now that that for the Rambam and for the philosophy he's been espousing this entire book, that's a very problematic assertion. What does that mean that God is testing? What does that mean that he didn't know what he was going to do? And if God is truly just, why would he put someone through suffering and torture in order to achieve some sort of it just doesn't work. So the Rambam in the first half of chapter 24 that we read last week, the Rambam emphasizes strongly that it does not mean that God is testing you out. There's no such thing as him putting you through such a situation in order to see what happens. But rather, what God is trying to do is show us a lesson. The story is being told in the Torah in order to teach us something that's important. And when it says that it's a nisayon, it's more of a nace, it's more of a sign as opposed to a test, right? A sign to us to teach us a lesson. And then the Rambam is about to discuss the subject of the most difficult and probably the most prominent test of all, which is the test that Abraham had at the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And I read to you last time, before I read it, so I'm on page 500, the third paragraph. It starts as for the story of Abraham at the binding. That's where we're going to start. However, before I do that, I wanted to summarize that which I read to you from Kenneth Zieskin, who explains the Rambam's explanation of the story of Akedat Yitzchak. And those of you that either watching now or are with us now or are watching the recording that haven't heard the previous lecture, I very strongly recommend that you go back and listen, because I read it in detail, and I'm just going to say it quickly now. And the real power you get by hearing it in detail. But the bottom line is that Ziskin there reminds us how the Rambam understands the concept of a nevuah, of a prophecy, and in a prophecy, according to Rambam, a prophecy is the wisdom that one gets, right, by completely negating his selfish interests and having complete control over his intellect, having a control over all the possible knowledge that a person can gain, having a personality that allows one to see something completely without bias, without selfish bias, and understand and see truth. And that when one does that, one is tapping into the active intellect. That's the active intellect which one thinks, and he's able to control. A true prophet can control his imaginary the imaginary part of his cognition, right? Which is so influenced by the physical things that we see, the images that we see, the sights that we see, the smells that we smell, the tastes that we taste, and so on, and the desires that we have, right? But a prophet is able to intellectually come to a conclusion and completely control his imagination so that he's able to create an image that's 100% truth. And when he sees that, that's a prophet. So according to Rambam, when Abraham was presented with the vision, right, that idea that devotion to God is so complete, his love and his for God is so complete that he saw in prophecy something that seemed to be so completely true to him, which was the idea that he should sacrifice the thing that's the most dear to him. And Abraham came to that conclusion. And then when he arrived at Har Moriah, when he got to that point, that same prophetic ability, Abraham was able to rise to a level even higher and see that there's a limit. That yes, the devotion to God is limitless, but I'm sorry, yes, it's huge, it's tremendous, and it should go really far. But there's a point beyond which it's not supposed to go, and that's where it comes to the point of causing the death of someone else, especially a child, right? So that what we're really reading about is the process of Abraham himself seeing the truth of his vision initially, and then seeing even more so the truth of his vision later, in which he saw that this is the limit. This is the limit. Yes, I love God, but this is not what God wants me to do. The love of God has no limits, right? But the things that the love of God calls upon me to do does have limits. Now, I'm now going to read. I read Kenneth Easkin because he is bringing other pieces of the Rambam together in order to understand this part. Here, and now I'm going to read what the Rambam says. So I'm going to start from, like I said, chapter 500 till the end of this chapter. And then I intend to, after that, I want to read to you from a famous letter, which was really, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Rambam's first public letter, first public responsa that he wrote for public consumption, and it's called his Igeret Hashmad, which is it's sometimes called the Igeret Kiddush Hashem, the letter of sanctification of God's name, and I want to. It's a pretty long letter, but it's incredibly powerful. But it's very, very closely tied. Most scholars, including the guys that wrote the book you guys got me, Len Goodman and Philip Lieberman, they say that you can almost hear echoes of the Igeret Hashmad in this little half of chapter 24 that we're about to learn now. So let me get to it. So as for the story of Abraham at the binding, it contains two great notions that are fundamental principles of the law. One of these notions consists in our being informed of the limit of love for God, may he be exalted, and fear of him. That is, up to what limit they must reach. In other words, right, what we learn from hearing and learning from Abraham, from Avram Avinu's visions and Avram Avinu's nevuah and his prophecies here, what we learn is where it ends, right? We see from here that love of God goes up to a point, but there are things that you're not supposed to do for the love of God. For in this story, he was ordered, but because what was the emotional process that Avram Avinu went through? He was ordered to do something that bears no comparison either with sacrifice of property or sacrifice of life, right? Specifically, it was chosen that he should have a prophecy that tells him to do something that can't be explained in any way, right? It can't be explained by saying a person should be willing to give up his property or to give up his own life. We asked him to give up his son's life, right? Which is something that you can't logically explain in any way. The only reason why somebody can possibly rationalize such a thing is because of a love of God that has no limits, right? In truth, it is the most extraordinary thing that could happen in the world. Such a thing that one could not imagine that human nature is capable of it. If there's a sterile man having exceeding desire for a son, possessed of great property and commanding respect, having the wish that his progeny should become a religious community, he thinks that his son is going to be the forebearer of a great nation. When his son comes to him after his lost hope, his whole life he's wishing he finally has a son. How great will his attachment and love to be for him? However, because of his fear of God, who should be exalted, and because of his love to carry out his command, he holds this beloved son as little. He doesn't even value this child as much as he values this relationship with God. He gives up all of his hopes regarding him and hastens to slaughter him after a journey of days. Had he chosen to do it right away, the Rambam is pointing out that the fact that the journey took several days shows, had Avram Avinu chosen to go ahead and do the Akedah immediately, right, we would have thought he went bonkers, right? We wouldn't have thought that proves anything, right? it would have been an act of stupefaction and disturbance in the absence of exhaustive reflection. We would have thought he must have just lost his mind, right? He must have went crazy. He must have been mentally disturbed, right? But his doing it days after the command shows that the action it sprang from thought and correct understanding because he had this idea: the love of God is endless, it's boundless, it's limitless. So even something like this, I should be willing to do. Consideration of the truth of the command, and so on. No other circumstance should be put forward, nor should one opt for the notion that he was in a state of passion. It wasn't just because he got overcome with some passionate force and he went and did it. For Abraham didn't hasten to do it because he was afraid that God would kill him or make him poor. God didn't threaten him into it, right? But solely because of what is incumbent upon human beings, upon the Adamites. To love and fear him may be exalted, and not, as we have explained in several passages, for any hope of a reward or fear of punishment. God didn't say, I promise that X, Y, Z is going to happen, or I'm going to give you a big punishment if you don't. That's not what happened. Accordingly, the angel said to him, for now I know that you fear God, meaning that through the act because of which the term fearing God is applied to you, all the Adamites, all human beings will know what the limits of the fear of God are. Because you did this, people will now know what the limits are. It's interesting that the Rambam chooses the limits because he's mixing two ideas. Number one, you see that Abraham was overcome with the idea that he should be willing to do anything because of the love of God. But we also learn because he was willing to do that, we also see, but no, there is a limit to what we're supposed to do for the love of God. And that was the ultimate lesson learned, that there is a limit, and that limit is the sacrifice of the child. Know that this notion is corroborated and explained in the Torah, in which it is mentioned that the final end of the whole Torah is one thing only, namely, fear of him may be exalted. This is referred to in its dictum: if you will only take care of, observe this law, and so on. This is one of the two notions aimed at in the binding. In the story of Akedat Yitzchak, so notion number one is, what are the limits of fear of God? That Abraham had this limitless idea, and then he learned that it ends, right? That there is a limit, and that was that the sacrifice wasn't wanted, but that his desire was for everything. His desire was limitless and boundless. So the second note, so that's idea number one. The second notion, and I'll reiterate again to listen to what I said last week when I explained this in more length, but that's the basic idea. The second notion consists in making known to us the fact that the prophets consider as true that which comes to them from God in prophetic revelation. When a prophet goes through that process and sees something like this, it is completely true in his mind. There's no doubt whatsoever in the mind of the prophet about the truth of the vision that he has. For it should not be thought that what they hear appears in a parable is not certain or is commingled with illusion just because it comes about in a dream or a vision. Don't think that he's waking up in the morning and saying, oh, I saw something floating in the sky and this and this and that, and they have some kind of vague notion as to what it might tell them. That's not how it works, right? Through the which and through the intermediary of the imaginative faculty. Accordingly, the Torah, the scripture wished to make it known to us that what is seen by a prophet in a vision of prophecy is, in the opinion of the prophet, a certain truth. He sees it with complete clarity. It is true that the prophet has no doubts in any way concerning anything in it, and that in his opinion its status is the same as that of all the existent things that are apprehended through the senses of the intellect. It's as true as the grass is green, as the sky is blue, as anything that we see with our eyes or our senses. A proof for this is the fact that he went to slaughter as it had been commanded, his son, his only son, whom he loved, as the verse states clearly, even though this command came to him in a dream or a vision, even though he saw it in a vision of prophecy, he still went and did something this dramatic. So to tell us, to emphasize to us that whenever we read a prophecy throughout the Torah, we need to know that the prophecy to the prophet was 100% clear as day. For if a dream of prophecy had been obscure for the prophets, or if they had doubts, they would not have hastened to do. I just turned the page. That was repugnant to nature. He never would have done something like this, or went to do something like this, had there been even the remotest doubt as to whether or not he felt that this was true. He would never have consented to accomplish an act so great in importance if there had been a doubt about it. In truth, it was fitting that this story should come, the binding, the story of Akedat Yitzchak, and on the second paragraph on 502, should come to pass through the hand of Abraham. and with regard to someone like Isaac. Why? Because Abraham was the first to make known the belief in unity, in other words, monotheism, to establish prophecy as a concept, as an idea, and to perpetuate the opinion and draw people to it. It says, "For I have known him to the end that they may command his children, his household after him, so they may keep the way of God, so on, to do righteousness and judgment, to do tzedek and mishpat. Thus, just as they followed his correct and useful opinions, namely, those that were heard from him, so ought one to follow the opinions deriving from his action, and especially from this action, through which he validated the fundamental principle affirming the truth of prophecy, and made known to us the ultimate end towards which the fear and love of God may reach." So that's what we learn from the story. It is in this way. So now the Rambam now just went through the idea of trials, of nisyonot, right? And this is how you need to understand the meaning of trials. This is how the meaning of trials should be understood. It should not be believed that God, may be exalted, wants to test and try out a thing in order to know that which he did not know before. But rather, right, and how greatly is he exalted above that which is imagined by ignorant fools in their evil thoughts. Know this. In other words, ignorant fools who think that that's what's going on don't understand the point. The point is you need to look at the story and see what principle, what idea is God trying to teach us by conveying this story to us in the Torah. So this is how the Rambam discusses Akedat Yitzchak. I want to now. I'm going to go off of the guide for the perplexed for the rest of tonight. I'm going to go to a different letter from the Rambam, and it's a little long. I'm probably going to skip a little here and there, but it is like I said. So the Rambam, as we mentioned a couple times from his biographical story, right? If we remember, his family when he was a young man or a boy. I see a hand raised. Go ahead.
Could you correct my recollection? As I recall, the angel intervenes. It's not as if Abraham says, "Oh,
yes, but remember, what does Rambam say an angel is? See, that's one of the details you got to listen to last week's. Okay. It's okay. I'm not criticizing you.
No, I didn't hear. Well,
but
it's a messenger of God, right?
Right, but the angel, right, is but according to the Rambam, an angel is how a prophet gets his knowledge, right? In other words, an angel, yes, is what speaks in a prophecy. That angel is the active intellect of Abraham perceiving the message of truth, right? That the Rambam explained that. We did go through that together, but Diskin reminded us of that when we read it last week.
Well, let me ask you then
Go ahead.
related questions. This obviously is not the way usually I've heard it. It's very, very sophisticated. Why would God speak to Moses through the Torah to give such a complex message? Because this has been interpreted that there is no limit to God. And, this is what we're learning, that if God commands you to do this, you're supposed to do it. That's the way, I used to think it meant. There's no limit to love for God. So why are we getting this message from God that's just the reverse?
So I'm trying to think how to go about answering that.
Maybe I'll hold it on a shelf until I read your earlier.
I don't want to keep pushing to last week, but we did discuss this at much more length.
Okay.
So I do recommend that you check that out.
I will do that. Thank you.
Okay.
So
yes.
So I have a question.
Yes.
If prophecy is a clear understanding of something that the prophet interprets and sees it very clearly. So his first vision was that he should show that he is totally in fear and in love of God, and so he's going to sacrifice his son. That was the first clear message that he got.
Right.
And then he got a totally different clear message that maybe there is a limit in what you can do in terms of your love and fear of God.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other place in prophecy where this has occurred, where a prophet has had two clear visions that were in opposition? Or is this something?
So I'm not sure. See, I hear what you're saying. It's a very good question, but I think I think I can't think offhand of an example. There may be, but it doesn't come to mind right away. However, I'm not sure that they're really in opposition. I think it was a, I think both lessons are still true. In other words, the what we're willing to do because of our love and fear of God is limitless, right? How, no, no, I'm sorry. That's not the right way of saying it. I mean to say our love and fear of God is limitless, right? What the actions that we are supposed to take in order to demonstrate that love have limits and bounds. And that's really the lesson of the story, right? So yes, what Rambam is saying is uh, God, the Torah is choosing us an example, chose to put, to give us an example of Abraham willing to do something that would teach us the limitless nature of our love and fear of God, right? However, the boundaries are the actions that we can or should take, right? Because of that love and fear of God. And one of those actions that's abhorrent is the action of child sacrifice, right? So that yeah, there's a limit to what we're supposed to do, but there is no limit to the actual love and fear. So I'm not sure if they're really in opposition. I think
I
they're
see. So basically, maybe he's just over time thinking it out and clarifying it. Is that a way to look at
Yes,
it?
yes, I do. I do think so. Now, we are going to have some hints in the letter that I'm going to read as to specifically this issue. The reason why I'm choosing this letter, you'll understand why, but you'll understand how the Rambam plays with and tries to get through the nuances of just how far a person is supposed to go to demonstrate his love for God, right? And but yeah, I think that that's really what the process that Avraham Avinu went through at the Akedah, and I think that's what the Rambam is saying. So just a little background again. Rambam was a young man when his family ran from Spain when the Almohads, which were a group of Muslim extremists that came and they invaded Spain, and there was a significant amount of religious persecution. So they ran. They ended up in Morocco, and then in Morocco it ended up also being terrible religious persecution, and there was a lot of forced conversions to Islam. Now, the question was opposed to the Rambam is how to treat those people, and there were many who basically said, all that they're asking me to do is to say, I forget the exact nature, but it's basically you say, I believe there's one God and Muhammad is his true prophet, or something like that. And you make that statement, poof, you're a Muslim, done, right? And they would make that statement, and then they would go home and continue being Jews because this way, you know, and because otherwise, it was that better than death. So the question is how do we relate to such people? And the Rambam is responding to a letter, and you'll hear that he was. It's funny because the way he attacks this rabbi and what he writes. But this rabbi basically well, let me let the Rambam say it. Let's read it inside. So the Rambam was just, needless to say, extremely upset with what this person wrote, and there's so much in here that's relevant to the way people talk today as well. And um, here we go. So thus says Moses, the son of Maimon, the judge, the Sephardi, right? Even though he was living in Cairo, he called himself the Sephardi because he came from Spain. He still considered himself a Spaniard. A contemporary of ours addressed a question concerning. I'm reading an English translation that was published in a Tradition, which is a journal. It was published in the 1970s. This English translation of the letter. A contemporary of ours addressed a question concerning the tragic problem of apostasy to a pseudo scholar who lived in a community which, unlike most other places, was spared the affliction of apostasy. May the Almighty uproot it. In other words, Rama is pointing out that the rabbi who wrote this letter, which was very critical of those who apostatized, who did say the Muslim confession, right? Had never himself experienced this kind of. He was lucky enough to be in an area that didn't get attacked by the extremist Muslims. So it involved some Jews who, under compulsion, had to confess the authenticity of Muhammad as God's messenger and as a true prophet. They were given one of two choices, either to accept the Mohammedan confession and spare their children from falling into the hands of their oppressors, or refuse to pronounce the Islamic formula and suffer martyrdom, a fate presumably prescribed by the laws of Moses. Presumably, in other words, that the Torah, it was assumed, tells us that we have to not take the confession and give our lives for it, right? That's what, right, presumably prescribed, okay? So the dilemma was compounded by the apprehension that the bearing of witness to the Islamic faith might ultimately lead to the undermining of the entire corpus of Jewish precepts. The consultant responded in a most derisive and distasteful manner, stylistically and contextually. The arguments projected by him were without foundation even for the unenlightened. At first, I was tempted to reproduce the entire text, despite its length, misrepresentation, and confusion, were it not for the fact that I was solicitous of human speech, which the Almighty has told us, who hath given speech to man, is it not I, the Lord? I'm going to skip a little bit, but basically he says, keeping in mind excessive verbiage often beclouds relevant content. So he didn't want to waste his time reprinting this guy's entire letter. Clearly, because we are grounded in this matter and find it hard to tolerate the ignorance of this man, we have selected just a part of his response, omitting the extraneous material. And remember, Rambam was writing this before he had achieved the status of the Rambam. This was his first public letter, okay? Just bear that in mind when we read this. If it's not his first, it's one of his first. I don't know, there may have been a few others, but it was very early in his career. Consider, for instance, his statement to the effect that he who utters the formula of Mohammedan confession, it is accounted unto him as if he denied the Lord, the God of Israel. He supports his conclusion by citing the rabbinic admonition that one who admits to idol worship, it is as if he denied the whole Torah. But if he fails to distinguish between one who confesses to idol worship without compulsion, as Jeroboam and his followers did, and another who is coerced at the point of a sword into uttering an empty formula referring to that impostor as a prophet, right? So how could you compare somebody who the statement that he said, if you admit to idol worship, it's denying the Torah, is talking about someone who actually goes and worships idols, not someone who has a sword to his head or to his neck and then says some stupid comment about some imposter being a prophet, right? To be sure, I was reluctant at first to controvert his statement until I became aware of the entire response. In other words, I didn't even want to say anything at first. I thought it was so bad. In keeping, with the admonition of the wise author, and when I probed, I'm skipping a few lines, when I probed further into the text, I discovered the following, that he who utters this formula, even if he fulfills the whole Torah in secret and in public, must be considered a pagan, right? So the Rambam is saying that the Rambam is quoting this guy as saying that a person that under the threat of life, right, says a stupid statement about Muhammad, all of a sudden everything else he does in Torah is worthless. Apparently, there is no distinction in his distorted mind between one who does not observe the Sabbath because of coercion or willfully. Right? Anyone with a brain would realize that if you have a guy who goes and does not keep Shabbat because he has a gun to his head, it's not the same as a guy who doesn't keep Shabbat because he wants to go to the beach. Right? There's obvious, it should be pretty clearly. He states further, the Rambam says, that if one just enters Islamic houses of worship to pray, although he does not utter a sound, and then proceeds to his own home to offer his prayers, the latter is accounted unto him as an affront and a sin. Again, he makes no distinction between one who prostrated himself before idols and temples as an act of apostasy in order to contaminate God's holy place and profane his sacred name, or one who enters such places under compulsion with the intention to extol God's name and not to make a single pronouncement contrary to his religious beliefs. He moreover maintains that a forced Mohammedan confession brands him as a wicked person, and the Torah disqualifies him as a witness, as we read it so on. After reading his reviling, blasphemous, and long harangue reflecting his ignorance and folly, and this is where the line, there's a lot that I'm going to read to you, but he's about to say something that directly relates to the subject of tonight. I was still hesitant to initiate a confrontation with him. I still, in the drama saying, I still was going to just throw his thing in the garbage and go on with my life and not say anything until I read his final words. right? In keeping with Solomon's exhortations, better is the tov achris davar mereshiso, right? Better is the end of a thing than the beginning. And alas, I came across the following startling concluding remarks. And he, quote, heretics and Christians would rather submit to death than accept the Islamic doctrines. Now, I'm going to read the Rambam's words in a minute, but think for a moment what the implications, well, you know what, let's see what the Rambam says. When I pondered the implication of this statement, I was shocked with amazement and exclaimed, is there no God in Israel? Suppose the practice of heathen worshippers entailed the sacrifice of children as burnt offerings. Should we therefore emulate them and act likewise in the service of our God? Like, what in the world? What, I'm going to paraphrase the Rambam. What in the world is this guy saying? Because heretics and Christians decide to give their lives, that means we should do the same thing. Like, what is he saying, right? Because they do something that may not be that's terrible, right? We should, right? And what we're really seeing here, you know, he's literally he's referring to, you know, bringing a child as a burnt sacrifice, right? Which we know is not something that God wants from us. In other words, our love and fear of God has a limit. That's where it goes. It goes up to there, but not beyond there, right? And so you're telling me that we should learn from heretics and Christians to do something that's morally wrong? Woe to such questions, woe to such a response. Manifestly, when I observed in the beginning of his response an attempt to marshal evidence, I exclaimed, I'm skipping a little, which might be an outrage. How appropriate is this? Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit. Then Rambam says himself, one should know that before communicating ideas to the general public, it is essential to review them thoroughly 2, 3, or 4 times in private prior to exposing them in public. Don't hit send after you write the angry email, right? Think once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Our sages derived such a procedure, and so on. I'm going to skip a little bit. The reference here is thus to oral communication. When one is involved in putting something in writing, an even greater effort of a possible 1,000-fold review is required. But this man, who obviously failed to act in this manner, preferred to cast his notions into a fixed mold in haste without first preparing a draft copy for review and proper corrections. Reflecting an arrogance that entertains no doubts about one's position, he proceeded in a doctrinaire fashion to dispatch his response through a messenger to every city and country, plunging the hearts of our co-religionists into darkness, which is reflected in the words of the psalmist, he sent darkness and caused it to be dark. I shall proceed now to explain the grievous error committed by this fanatic doctrinaire, who failed to realize the consequences of his own actions. One wonders how he could possibly conceive that he was doing the right thing when the result of his actions was so disastrous. Moreover, in the process of rendering his decision, he produced many illustrations that were incongruous to the central theme. In refutation of his distorted arguments, I wish to state the following. Our rabbis have made it clear that the children of Israel before the exodus from Egypt, with the exception of the tribe of Levi at the time of Moshe, deviated from the true paths of Judaism and even neglected the covenant of circumcision. I'm going to skip a little bit, right? Thus, demonstrating how the Jews had not been doing circumcision, how they had entered idolatry in Egypt, and they were not exactly the best behaved, right? And they were actual idolaters, right? Not having been coerced, right? Thus, the assertion by one of the sages that I'm going to skip a little, but despite their evil practices and deviations, Moshe himself was condemned by the Almighty for accusing them of faithlessness. When he said, behold, they will not believe in me, he was admonished. Moses, there are believers, and they are believers, and the children of believers. But, all right, as it is written, and the people believed. And with regard to being the children of believers, we read, and he believed. But as far as Moshe was concerned, it turned out that in the end, he was the unbeliever. As we find, because you have not believed in me to sanctify me, he was subsequently punished. In keeping with the rabbinic dictum, one who accuses the innocent is subject to personal punishment, as the case with Moses. So Rambam is saying the people of Israel were actual idol worshippers. But nonetheless, when Moshe criticized them, the result was Moshe himself getting punished for that very same sin. You can hear what Rambam, how angry he is at this person for tearing apart thousands and thousands of Jews that went through such terrible suffering, and they went ahead and muttered under the threat of their lives. They muttered a formula saying that Muhammad is a prophet. All of a sudden, nothing they do is worthwhile. All of a sudden, all they are is worth, it's just criticism. He brings a similar story from Eliyahu. I'm gonna just for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip through it. He talks about Yeshayahu when he mentions that there's sinful nation, then Yeshayahu gets punished, and Yoshua, and so on. He goes through a whole bunch. Yeshua ben Yotzadak and Zechariah in the book of Zechariah. So now, if such punishment was meted out to the great pillars of Judaism like Moshe, Eliyahu, Yeshayahu, because they maligned the people of Israel, we imagine the penalty awaiting an ordinary, insignificant simpleton who, with a loose tongue, dared to assail whole communities, their scholars, their disciples, priests and Levites, calling them transgressors, wicked men, heathens unfit to bear witness, and deniers of the Lord of Israel. How much more severe his punishment will be considering he stated those accusations in writing with his own hands. For alas, the oppressed did not rebel against God because of a relentless pursuit of a high position or evil passions, and so on, right? So I'm skipping a little more. And then he brings stories from Chazal, from Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer, also saying the same idea, that that they were punished for and that they had done actions which made it look like they might be admitting to idolatry to get out of difficult situations. I'm going to skip a little just for the sake of time. Furthermore, the vicissitudes visited upon Israel at the time of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar are well known. I'm thinking I'm just skipping a little bit. He mentions the time of Hanukkah. Had we not agreed at the outset not to reproduce the entire exposition of this indiscreet chatter, I would have presented his text in full for your information. How can one be so ignorant of his own deficiencies and articulate such words or write a response which is utterly irrelevant? I'm skipping a little. He mentioned here, he further states that the Mohammedans have a pagan altar in Mecca and in other places, as if someone inquired of him whether it is permissible to celebrate a festival in Mecca. In other words, who cares what they do in Mecca? They didn't ask these Jews to go to Mecca. They asked them to say something. His assertion that Muhammad was responsible for the extermination of 24,000 Jews is likewise astonishing. Inasmuch as no one asked him whether Muhammad merited a share in the world to come, no one asked you whether Muhammad was a tzaddik. No, so he wasn't a tzaddik. He was a terrible guy, and he caused the death of thousands of Jews. But that wasn't the question you were asked. So he goes on. And God is my witness, and that is sufficient for me, that if he who had uttered these reproaches against us had uttered many more, we should, wait, I'm skipping a little more. Had he, you get the idea. I shall now I'm at his third section, proceed to point out further the errors of this man's confusion. The Bible describes Achav ben Omri as a denier of God and a worshiper of idols. But nonetheless, when he fasted for 2.5 hours, right, our rabbis tell us the severe decree against him was annulled. In other words, even a person who's a true idolater, if they do something right, they deserve credit for it. And he mentions the same thing from Eglon and Esav. He brings proofs. And now, if those infamous atheists were rewarded by God for the performance of just a minor good deed, how can we say that the Lord will not recompense the children of Israel, who, while they dwell in a forced pseudo-apostasy, practice the mitzvot in secret? It is apparent. I'm skipping another criticism of this guy. I decided to divide my comments in regards to this matter into 5 categories. I want to look and see which parts, because it's beautiful. Once he completely attacks this writer, this rabbi, he then goes ahead and says, he goes through the laws of Kiddush Hashem, okay, the laws of when one is supposed to give their lives, and when one is not. It's a pretty in-depth discussion, and I'm skipping most of it. And if those of you want, I can send you links afterwards to where you can find an English translation. But give me 1 minute here. I want to just pick just a couple things that I think are really important. I'm going to kind of skip all the way to the end. Okay, so this is, I'm going to where the Rambam says the fourth category, and this is his advice. The fourth category deals with the difference between the present religious persecution and previous experience. So he says, one who preferred to suffer martyrdom in order not to pronounce the Mohammedan confession has done nobly and well, and his reward is great before the Lord. That's what he concludes. He may be regarded as supremely virtuous as he was willing to surrender his life for the sanctification of the name of God. Should one, however, and listen to this carefully, inquire of me, the Rambam says, shall I be slain? In other words, if someone asks me a question, they're standing there and there's a sword to their neck, shall I be slain or pronounce the Mohammedan confession? My answer would be, quote, utter the formula and live, end quote. To be sure, one should not continue to live in such an environment, but until the opportunity presents itself to leave, one should be confined to the privacy of his home and conduct his transactions in secret. For this kind of apostasy directed exclusively at compelling verbal confession is unique. A rabbi's contention of better to suffer death than committed transgression was never meant to imply a single transgression without an action. The reference is only to a transgression in action, which involves positive precept. They ask you to do something that violates the Torah, but not one simple statement which without any action. In this period of religious persecution, I should like, therefore, to propose several modes of behavior incumbent upon us. And basically what he goes through saying that is that we should move to a place where you don't have to suffer the persecution. But if it's just a matter, yes, a person that does give his life rather than say it is noteworthy, and it's a tremendous kiddush shemayim. But ultimately, it's better just to mumble something silly and then go home and still remain a faithful Jew. It's a very long letter, so I'm not going to go through everything, but I specifically brought it up because of his reference to the sacrificing one's child, right? And that being, the limit beyond which God doesn't want us to go. I think that this is I'll end my discussion here of this subject of Akedat Yitzchak, and I'll open the floor to questions or comments, because kind of a lot of powerful stuff we went through tonight. Yes, Yosef, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that that last point about Dibur, as far as I know, the only two things that we are punished for using our mouth as lo tachsom, shor b'dishor, right? That you and kilaim, right? Kilei be'ema, the same idea that you're telling the animal to move, to go, and but there was something else related to it. Anyway, there's only two that I remember that we
punished
are
for speech.
Yeah, and but Maimonides lived in a time where I guess it was before America, but there is no safe place for Jews today unless you go to the jungle where they're not going to force you to do anything, but they might eat you.
Well, he discussed it in more detail, like the obligation to try to do the best you can to get to a community where you can live Judaism safely, and one of these places, I'll read you a paragraph here, a little bit farther on from where I got up to. However, this is Rambam's words: the position of those who are seduced into remaining in their places until the advent of the Messiah in the West, who will lead them to Jerusalem, is the most untenable of all. I do not understand how this will relieve them of their present state of apostasy. In the meantime, they are guilty and cause others to transgress the law. Concerning them, the prophet decries, and they heal the breach of the daughters of my people very lightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. For indeed, there is no definite time assigned for the appearance of the Messiah. And no one can state with any assurance whether his coming will be in the near future or at some remote period. So if you decide, I'm going to stay here because Mashiach is coming soon and he'll get me out, that doesn't work. If you have a better place to go, go. You have no excuse. And it's reflected in Rambam's own choice for how he lived his own life. It's pretty clear that the Rambam had to live as in public as a Muslim for a period of time in Morocco before he was able to escape. And the moment he was able to escape, he did. And he ended up. They went various places, but they went to the land of Israel, but it wasn't safe there, and they ended up going to Cairo. And that's where he was able to practice a Jewish life. Anyway, what I just saw from this letter was just his concern and compassion for what the people were going through. It's just so strong, and he's so passionate about understanding the suffering that they're going through and not slamming people and making them feel terrible and bad about doing something that they obviously did under duress. Like, how do you make such judgments, of how you're supposed to behave when there's a sword to your neck? And that's really the most powerful thing of all that comes out of that letter. Any other comments before we move, before I conclude tonight?
Yeah, much later after he did this letter, obviously the same thing happened in Spain at the time of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Is there any parallel or any discussion about this letter in relation to what happened later on in history?
Well, there's some people would, there's a few things that are clear. Like, the Rambam would definitely not have criticized those who chose to keep Judaism in secret and just admit to Christianity in public, right? Because he certainly would have said, well, they're forced to it, right? And we shouldn't consider them sinners, and we should welcome them back into the community, and we shouldn't, and so on. There might be, some could argue that there might be a philosophical difference between Christianity and Islam, because Christianity is edging a little bit closer over the edge than Islam does in terms of Judaism. Because in Islam, all they were really asking them to do is admit that Muhammad is a prophet, which isn't, I mean, it's not something that we Jews agree with, right? But it's not apostasy. It's not, it's not like, denying God.
Like conversion, basically.
Yeah, you're stating a fact that doesn't jive with Judaism, and it doesn't work, but it's not like it's not a blasphemous statement, whereas Christianity, but still, the one thing is for sure that Rambam definitely, I mean, he made it very clear that you can never hold it against somebody if they do something under duress. So he would have welcomed those people that chose to convert outwardly to Christianity. He would have welcomed them with open arms, and he would have told them to get out of Spain, and he would have just get out of Spain and go to a place where you can practice Judaism in public. Yes, Leslie, go ahead.
Would his letter have been known, because initially the Inquisition went after the Jews who had converted, to Christianity, saying that they were not doing it.
His letter was definitely known, like, because it was a couple hundred years later when the Inquisition happened. So,
would it have been known to the Christian authorities? And that would it have prompted some of that?
Possible. I'm not aware of anyone writing about that, but it's possible. I mean, it was a very well-known letter, and Rambam wrote it to be publicized. This was not a secret letter at all, and this was meant to go, so a couple hundred years later in Spain, it had to have been known, to the general public. How much of an influence it had on the behavior of the church, I don't know. It's an interesting thing to speculate about, but I don't know if we'll ever really know. Yeah. And any other comments, observations? Anything about Akedat Yitzchak? If not, then we will.
Can I have one?
Go ahead.
The,
Yes.
the Kol Nidre prayer that we say on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. I mean, that goes back to the Inquisition period. So the Christians wanted to have a basis for saying, don't trust what the Jews say, or
Right.
they're trying to convert, they're all liars. I mean, wouldn't that be a better source, a more direct source for the Inquisition than this letter?
That
Oh,
sounds like it.
yeah, I think, yeah, that's more direct. That, you know, the part of one of the Rambam's arguments that I skipped through because there was a lot in there, was he said that even the people that putting the sword to your neck know that you don't mean it when you say it, right? They know you're saying it just because it's a bunch of baloney. It's all just an act, right? They're doing it. They're a power trip, you know. They want to show, oh, he said it, you know, but they know that you don't mean it, you know. No, everyone knows you don't mean it. If you put a sword to someone, I can say anything, you know. It doesn't mean nothing. So you know, that's part of what the Rambam says, you know, like, so you say this stupid statement about, like he said, that this imposter is a prophet. Okay, whatever, you know, fine. You know, it saved your life. You go home and get out of there. Pack up your bags. You know, but at least you saved your life and your family and you're done. You know. Anyway, yeah, so let's hope we never see such things, but unfortunately God only knows what's coming. All right, so we'll call it an end for tonight. Looking forward to next week. We have a lot more to study in this third part, which of the third chelek, which is chock full of really cool stuff like we haven't until now. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, son.
All right.